Back when I was a kid, it was really quite satisfying being a Brit. You opened your school atlas, though I suspect now it was probably a rather old version. A lot of the globe was still coloured in that rosy pink, the glorious British Empire upon which, it used to be said, the sun never set. Although various of these colonies, I subsequently found, weren't ours anymore in any realistic sense of the word. Goodness, when the Queen dies, still unclear whether they might even elect someone from one of those places to take over as head of the Commonwealth. But as well as the school atlas, I also had, as a youngster, the Reader's Digest Atlas of the World. And this had some other interesting maps in it. I was more interested in the map showing the depth of the oceans, I have to confess, but I do remember noticing another world map showing the world religions. And once again, so comforting, there seemed to be more of the globe coloured Christian than anything else. And the numbers in one corner confirmed it. So very nice to be part of the majority and somehow feel in charge and top dog, British Christian bulldog. But I don't think Jesus would have been impressed with my conclusion. The passage starts off with a question from Jesus about what the popular views of the day are. And yet, he didn't make a comment on the disciples' answers, did he? What the man in the street thought didn't really matter. They're not any kind of authority on it, really. Instead, Jesus focuses on them, those disciples. What's their take? Yet even what they say, glorious though it is only glorious because it lines up with what is, what God himself declares to be true. But because they have arrived at this perception of truth, Jesus now gives his disciples a glimpse of the future of their discipleship, based on the revelation concerning his own person. Now, will you excuse today almost tackily alliterated headings? It seems to work for this passage: the perceptions of Christ, the person of Christ, the promises of Christ. So we start with the perceptions. You might remember from the past couple of weeks, we've been visiting Matthew's Gospel, that Jesus has been spending quite a bit of his time in Gentile territory rather than Jewish. Last time, it's written as if he had only just arrived in Jewish territory again when this peculiar mixture of Pharisees and Sadducees arrived to give him a bit of a verbal kicking. Matthew 15:39 and 16:1. After sending away the crowds, he got into the boat and went to the region of Magadan. And the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and to test him, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. And after a very curt discussion, he leaves back across the Sea of Galilee again, out of range of any Jewish authorities. 16:4. So he left them and departed when the disciples reached the other side. But now he is going even further away into yet more decidedly pagan lands. 16:13. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi. So this is 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, in the foothills of Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is so tall it has snow on it all year round, I've heard. But that's not all. When I said pagan, I didn't just mean distant countryside, I meant pagan. There's religion here, not just physical geography to think about. The slopes there are filled with various shrines to various so-called gods. The cave where one source of that eventual river Jordan emerges houses a shrine to Pan and the nymphs. From that, you get the name of the cave, the Paneon. The region around it is called Paneas. In fact, 2,000 years later, I've heard it's still called Banias instead of Paneas. Not that dissimilar, is it? There's the big town in the region too. Well, big, maybe not by modern standards, but it had been rebuilt in the early years AD by Philip the Tetrarch, named Caesarea after the Emperor Augustus. Since other cities had been designated Caesarea as well, this one was distinguished from the others by the addition of Philippi, meaning of Philip. So there are all these traditional so-called gods, and there are these emperors who are also aspiring gods. It wouldn't be many decades until the disciples of Jesus Christ could be sent to their deaths for refusing to acknowledge that Caesar is Lord. So This is such an appropriate place for Jesus to ask this particular question. Where does the Son of Man, that's one of Jesus's favourite code phrases really for himself, where does he fit into this scheme? Is he Premier League or is he Little League? Is he in a class of his own? If he is in a class of his own, is he a lone runner ahead of the rest of the pack? Or is it a long distance race and he's a lone runner trying to catch up with the leading group? It's also very modern in this regard, isn't it? The world nowadays is insisting that everything is true, in at least some vague sense of the word. Yes, X can be God, and so can Y and Z, and God can be personal or impersonal or above personal. All of these mutually contradictory descriptions can be true at the same time, in some sense of the word true. It's not for us to insist that one is truer, or capital T true, more than any of the others. Well, that's the theory at least. But Jesus decides to test the waters here. It looks as if he's using one of his millionaire lifelines. And it's time to ask the audience. He asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? What are the current perceptions? What's today's trending answer? Where's the clever money going? What's the goss? And perhaps not surprisingly, there's a variety of answers doing the rounds. Notice the disciples wisely include only the complimentary answers. Some of Jesus's opponents had some other ideas, less complimentary about him. And they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah, one of the prophets. John the Baptist, raised from the dead. That's quite a complimentary idea, I think. Actually, Herod Antipas had that idea too, you might remember. Not so far back in the book, though in his case it was based more on superstitious fear. Elijah, that's quite a biggie too. There was something, wasn't there, in the Old Testament about him coming around again before God did something really remarkable. Malachi 4:5. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. So there's quite a few candidates, quite a few worthy candidates. But do you really think Jesus was asking for information here about who the local bookie's favourite was as for who he might turn out to be? Or has he chosen this as the perfect place with that almost literal pantheon by way of backdrop, almost suggesting that you can pick a god, any god? But he's picked this place to make a very specific teaching point. Hasn't he done this so very cleverly once again as well? We could perhaps learn from that, couldn't we? Instead of, well, ask what people are thinking. What are perceived as the current opinions? What are the options? Then spin the question round. Never mind them, people generally. What about you? Don't you have an opinion on this point? He said to them, but who do you say that I am? This is even more shocking and sudden and forceful the way it was originally said. We've got the standard English word order here, but a bit more literally, it is you, though, who do see the even more strong emphasis here. You, though, who do you say that I am? Now, folks, do we actually hide too often behind people say rather than I think or I believe? Isn't it strange that nowadays we can have all sorts of opinions about politics and sport, all sorts of things, but somehow your faith is thought too personal to be politely discussed or inquired about? Why is it that people react so violently against this? Maybe I should do what Jesus did. Flip this around and address not just people, but you. You didn't object when I asked you for your views about Brexit. So how come you object if I ask you about your opinion on Jesus Christ? Folks, how come that sometimes even in church we will talk about all sorts of stuff in today's news, but we are so reluctant to let the conversation move on to Jesus and you? There's this question, isn't there, about the person of Christ. I have to admit first, though, that we probably misread the scenario here a little bit based on the start of this verse. Simon Peter replied. We need to remember that the question he's replying to is spoken in the plural. In the deep south of the USA, they translate it a bit like this, excuse the accent. He said to them, but who do y'all say that I am? And I wonder if we're meant to see Peter's answers not just the typically impetuous answer by the guy who just couldn't keep his mouth shut. But instead, as a result of the disciples going into some kind of a huddle to think this through together. Because I think we're meant to see a bit of a contrast here between what has gone before in Matthew's gospel. The answer that Peter comes out with is not totally new. Right after Jesus and Peter, temporarily, walked on the water, Matthew 14, when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." See, it's been said before. But there, consider the context. They'd just been scared within an inch of their lives. They were right in what they said, of course. And they'd grown some appreciable distance from when, after a previous Sea of Galilee incident, their response was, "What sort of man is this that even the winds and sea obey him?" But here at Caesarea Philippi, the guys have a chance to get together without all the fear adrenaline coursing through their bodies, to think seriously how they should reply to Jesus' question. Who do they think he is, really? Based on all that they've seen over the last couple of years, what do they make of Jesus? Does he really rate what most people think of as his surname, Christ? And so perhaps it is now Peter not answering just for himself, but at least to some extent as the spokesperson of the group. From what Jesus says in a moment, maybe Peter is the one who first dared to propose this answer, the Christ, but they've considered it together, and on reflection, well, yeah, this does fit the bill very well. So go on, Peter, you said it first, you say it. Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And goodness, you couldn't get much more emphatic the way this has been written in the original language. Just as you, or Yal, was stressed in Jesus' question, it is the same in Peter's answer. The you is stressed. And what we technically call the definite article, the English word the word that specifies one thing rather than another, is here actually 4 times in these words. It is literally the Christ, the Son of the God, the living one. Is this Jesus just one among many? You really couldn't get much more definite an answer than this, could you? Pan is no God at all. Caesar is not Lord. And Jesus is not just some kind of heavenly messenger. He's been sent by the one and only true God, but as his Son. Watch out for that in a later parable. And because of that special calling, just like some of the Old Testament prophets and priests and kings, he has been anointed or Christed, using the root of the Greek word, for what is a unique role. It's a role that the disciples still have quite a bit to learn about. We'll find out as we read on. But these guys are starting to catch the scent here. They're following not just a rabbi, not just a teacher, but the Christ, the Son of the God, the living one. Folks, can you see how this is dynamite today? The world insists on a level playing field. All religions must be considered equal. All truths are relative. Nothing is absolute and absolutely true. The world absolutely insists on that one. But what Matthew writes here, what the Bible has said all along, insists that we worship the Christ, the Son of the God, the living one. We Christians cannot surrender either finality or the uniqueness of Jesus Christ. Quote from John Stott here. There is simply nobody else like him. His incarnation, atonement, and resurrection have no parallels. In consequence, he is the one and only mediator between God and the human race. This exclusive affirmation is strongly, even bitterly resented. It is regarded by many as intolerably intolerant. That's a prophetic word, isn't it? Intolerably intolerant. Written back in 1995, that book, Authentic Christianity. Yet the claims of truth compel us to maintain it, however much offence it may cause. And as we read that quote from John Stott, you might well say, well, yes, of course, it is so obvious. The miracle of his birth and his death and his resurrection. How can people not see this? Why don't they get it? Yes, it is logical, but it is also, says Jesus, spiritual. It's a gift from God if you see it. Mere intellect will not bring you to this conclusion. Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." So if you don't really get it, yes, of course, read this stuff over and over. But can I suggest that you pray for God to do what is sometimes sung as a simple chorus? Open my eyes, Lord. I want to see Jesus. You need to move on from the various possible perceptions of Christ to the true person of Christ. And then I want you to look at the promises of Christ. There's some tough stuff here before we finish today. Some of these following words have been debated down through the centuries. We'll come back and discuss some of them this evening in more detail if you like. But let's at least start by opening the box and seeing what's inside. There's some glorious stuff here. There's the rock, the church, the gates of hell, and the keys of the kingdom, but one at a time. The rock. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock. Now, the Catholics, as I'm sure you will know, regard Peter as the rock upon which the church is built. They claim he was the first bishop of Rome, and that his successors retain preeminence over all other churches. Personally, I think the historical background there, this link to Rome, is difficult to prove. Quite how they get the preeminence thing out of this verse, I'm not really sure. One thing I am sure of, though, is that there is some wordplay going on here that doesn't translate with total clarity. So, first we'll consider the word petrified. We usually use it as a metaphor. We say someone is not just scared, but petrified, scared stiff. Literally, the word means turned to stone. If you visit Portreath Beach at extremely low tides, they're supposed to be the remains of a petrified forest. There's a picture which I got off the internet. Don't think I remember having seen it myself, but I remember my mum saying she'd seen them. Obviously, the person who'd taken that photograph did. That P-E-T-R word stem comes from the Latin word for stone. It's a name you could translate. Rocky. And that's Petros, or in modern English, Peter. Can you see how that wordplay just has to be significant here in Matthew's Gospel? And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock. They're not the identical word in Greek, but they're very, very similar. So it's pretty much a pun. I think it's that Peter is finally living up to this nickname that Jesus had given him earlier. John 1:42. He brought Peter to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, the son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which means Peter, which means rookie. So finally, Peter the impetuous, Peter the one who so often opened his mouth before putting his brain into gear, has come out with something of solidity and substance and weight. Here is Jesus saying, it's something we can start to build upon. To a certain extent, in the early days of the church, Peter would be one of the founding fathers. That's clear from Scripture. You could say that the church was, in a limited sense, built upon him, but others too. But those words that Peter spoke, that recognition of who Jesus is, that is clearly something absolutely fundamental to it all as well. Because in a few decades, Peter would die. You can debate whether he had any successors with apostolic authority bequeathed upon them. But that testimony to Jesus has persisted among the followers of Jesus to this day. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Peter's words are fundamental. The church, I've deliberately left the picture blank because most pictures we have don't seem to be very helpful. I will build my church, says Jesus. We probably think all too formally about that word church. We think buildings quite possibly, or something like the organization that Jesus founded. We get the word ecclesiastical from the Greek word. All to do with rituals and liturgy and robes and formality. But the word had a much more down-to-earth usage way back when Matthew wrote. It was simply a gathering. It could be organised, it could even be spontaneous. It was even used to describe an impending riot in Ephesus. Now, some cried out one thing, some another, for the assembly, the church, was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Couldn't resist putting that particular picture down at the bottom of the screen. It's also tempting to say that there are some churches around nowadays that could apply to, but that would be a bit unkind. And the bottom line is that it is a common or garden word which has grown and changed in the telling. And we need to remember that when we do church. It is at heart a meeting together of people in the name of Jesus. So some of the things that we most associate with church might not have featured at all in the mind of Jesus when he says these words. Ritual and robes and rows of hideously uncomfortable seats? Seriously? You think that's the kind of stuff he's talking about here? Did you realise that in the early days of church buildings, there were no seats? I suspect the people that the meeting literally lasted until people couldn't stand it anymore. But that counted as much as church with pews, or church with chairs, or even church in your own living room. People just meeting together in the name and in the presence of Jesus Christ. And see, that's why I'm not totally obsessed with our getting back into the building once the lockdown lifts. What we are doing now, as far as I can see it, is still church. Just as it was and probably still is in various places around the world, where believers gather out in the woods under the stars, the only place they dare meet with any substantial chance that they won't be spied upon by a repressive state. And if their version of communion is to eat a grape each, that's all they can dare on pain of imprisonment and likely death at the hands of the state, then that, I am sure Jesus would say, still counts as a holy communion. The gates of hell. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Isn't that an awesome promise? I've heard it suggested that there was some particular cave in that region of Caesarea Philippi. I think it was with some resident priestess or something like that, giving oracles, that typically woolly prophecies that can be taken all sorts of ways, but which convince people who already believe that they've heard something revelatory and profound. This cave, so the line goes, was called the gates of hell. Well, it could be. I've not seen this in any of the books I've been reading about this recently, so it could also be a myth that has just done the rounds courtesy of the internet. So a quick aside here, folks, do be careful of stuff that you get on your screens with startling, alarming new discoveries. There are actually some unkind people out there who just seem to delight in spreading unfounded scare stories, or, well, actually, yes, President Trump might actually be correct at times. There is fake news. And some people will target especially to jangle the chains of Christians. It doesn't do the gospel any favours if you and I believe every story that comes onto our screens without properly checking it. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is, apart from the gospel itself. If it seems too shocking to be true, it also probably is. I mean, not true, or at least not completely. So I'm just mentioning that there is the possibility that Jesus's words are particularly targeted at something in the neighbourhood of Caesarea Philippi. But even if there wasn't, even if this is just a verbal image that Jesus comes up with on the spur of the moment, you can still see what it's saying, can't you? Or can you? I think we typically miss a good deal of what this is saying. We can take this to mean that the church will survive. That would follow logically, wouldn't it? If it is Jesus doing this building of the church, the assembled people, maybe we should call it that. If it's Jesus doing it, not human committees or specially talented and gifted leaders, but Jesus himself, then doesn't it stand to reason that something Jesus would build will survive the centuries? Of course, the answer to that has to be yes. But what Jesus says here isn't about survival, but triumph. Think of all those battlefield images you've ever seen in books or films or whatever. I know that in The Lord of the Rings you get trees walking, but when have you ever seen gates walking? The whole point about gates in this imagery is that they are defensive measures. They can be massively fortified. Oh dear, my picture did not come out, sorry. They can seem impregnable. You think that even the mightiest battering ram could never prise them open. So what Jesus has to be saying here is that his church, his people assembled in some sense down through the ages, will penetrate the defensive perimeter of Hades, whatever that precisely stands for. That foul city will fall. And I think we can push the image a little. Not so much that the city will be plundered, but that captives held there will be liberated. Now, I think we need to get this different outlook into our thinking. My fear is that during lockdown, we've become even more inward looking. We've had to focus on getting something running in place of physical meeting, and we've done that. But what we do now is even more hidden than usual. Nobody sees us leaving to go to church. Nobody hears the guys discussing screw-tape letters in some local coffee shop. We just log in from the comforts of home. Folks, where are these gates of Hades in your current experience? Is there any enemy territory that we are starting to assault at all? Or are those gates just standing untroubled because we're now meeting safely and almost sweetly on Zoom? I recently heard of a group of pupils from my old secondary school wanting to get back in touch via Zoom. So a couple of times recently, I've met up with some substantially aged faces of people, some of whom I knew tolerably well at school. Someone had shared some pictures of the school football rugby team. I saw some pictures of a very young looking Nick Smith. I mentioned that his mum used to come to my church. And when people have asked, so Peter, what are you doing with yourself nowadays? I've been able to answer that I left chemistry research 15 years ago to come back to Cornwall and to work for a local church. Maybe something will come of this. Maybe not. I can't say this is a huge battering ram thudding on the gates of Hades, but I pray that it might be of some use for the kingdom of heaven. It's an opportunity, maybe. Any time you're in some kind of interaction with someone who is not a believer, it's an opportunity. If you have that moment, you can share something about what you do or who you are. Couldn't that? Shouldn't that? Isn't it an opportunity to introduce something about your relationship with Jesus Christ? Or are we content to let the gates of Hades stand proudly open and untroubled, despite the promise of Jesus that no matter how securely locked and barricaded they are, they will fall? Finally, the keys of the kingdom. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now, this is a bit tricky to try to finish with quickly. It's rather obscure to us nowadays, but if you're a first century person familiar with rabbis, it wouldn't be so complex. It's the way they expressed their teachings. What things are permitted, what things are forbidden. They bound some things and they loosed others. And a key, I would have thought, is the ideal symbol of just this, because you can use a key to lock or to unlock as appropriate. Now, the Catholics here will point to this you being singular. See, that's the Pope's special authority to make rules, they'll say. The Pope says priests can't marry or Christians can't use contraceptives. Look, it's bound in heaven because of what he has ordained, and Matthew 16:19. But I don't think we need to take it that way. It's Peter who spoke to Jesus, and now Peter is being answered by Jesus. Peter, you have started to live up to that nickname of yours. And that key understanding of who I am is something that I can build on. And the actions of people like you who believe the same thing, these people around you will profoundly affect the world around you. Actually, the precise wording here is not shall be, but shall have been. Future perfect. I wonder if this implies that it isn't so much that heaven falls into line with what is bound or loosed on earth, but that the decisions taken on earth are an expression of or a revelation of what has first been ordained in heaven. So when this Peter, maybe it's particularly significant that it's this Peter to whom this was said. Peter is sent for by a Gentile wanting to find out the truth about Jesus. At that point, Peter's actions will affect the mission of the whole church from then on. Will it remain targeted to the Jews? Will it henceforth be open to Gentiles as well? What was Peter's decision? Will he bind or will he loose? First, he was given a vision, concluding with the initially rather cryptic words, "What God has made clean, do not call common." Right at that moment, there's a knock on the door. "Will you come to the house of a Gentile?" And he does. And he tells them about Jesus. To him, all the prophets bear witness that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name. Wonderful summary of the gospel there, isn't it? And then heaven intervenes. When Peter was still saying these things, the Holy Spirit fell on all who heard the word. So question. Looks as if these people are believers, but they're Gentiles. Can we baptize them? Peter, will you keep this bound or will you loose it? But the Holy Spirit has already spoken. Whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. Then Peter declared, can anyone withhold water for baptizing these people who have received the Holy Spirit just as we have? And he commanded them to be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ. Folks, for us too, the calling is to roll out heaven's agenda here on earth, in our individual lives, in our homes and neighborhoods and workplaces, and strung around the world's social media friends lists. How we do that will depend on our perceptions of Jesus Christ. Is he one of many, or is he the one and only, the very definite, the Christ, the Son of the God, the living one? If you have that view of his person, will you hear and trust his promises? That his people will get out there and bring his light into dark places and break the shackles of the bound. That was the mission of Messiah, or Christ, right from the start. That's what Jesus claimed. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me. He has Christed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. If that has been proclaimed in heaven, what are we doing with it here on this little part of earth?